Fairy Tale. I Ate a Dragon at the Beginning. Chapter 11. Because of Lin En's appearance, these bandits were completely frightened and could no longer organize an attack. After the remaining magicians looked at each other, they left to clear out the bandits who were still in the manor. Lin En glanced at his hands, which had recovered as before, and were stained with bright red blood. The strong smell of blood immediately filled Lin's brain, causing Lin to frown and involuntarily waved his arms with disgust, shaking off a lot of the bright red on his hands. The fighting here didn't seem to affect the drinking party in Heartfilia Manor at all. The magicians were fighting desperately, and the nobles were still drinking in the villa inside the manor. It was not until the end of the cocktail party that the butler of the Heartfilia family and Jude saw off many nobles, and then they had time to see everyone. Everyone cleaned away the traces of the battle and put on clean clothes. Lin En also changed the clothes that were sticky and dyed bright red. In the crowd, Lin lowered his eyes and looked around erratically. Jude has already learned from everyone's mouths that the biggest contributor to the ability to stop the bandits this time was Lin En, who seemed inconspicuous among the crowd. With a smile on his face, Jude walked up to Lin En, stretched out his hand to Lin En and said, "Mr. Lin, thank you this time, thank you for blocking the bandit." Lin En raised his lowered eyes, he glanced at Jude with the vertical pupils in his pupils, and said lightly, "I'm just afraid that if you die, no one will pay me." Jude's outstretched palm froze in place, and the smile on his face froze slightly. Then Jude coughed lightly and said with a smile, "I will let someone pay for the payment this time. It's all thanks to you this time." Jude had a faint smile on his face, with a little smile on his face. Son is estranged. The magicians looked at each other and smiled immediately. Most of them teamed up to complete this commission, and Jude was generous in his actions. Even after a few of them were divided, there were still many. Among them, Harry and Kuila looked at each other and felt that the reward this time was too good. The two of them exerted almost no effort. After Jude left, Heartfilia's butler came to everyone with a smile and said to everyone, "Please have a good night's rest today. I will give you your rewards tomorrow." Yes. The magicians nodded and returned to the residence arranged by the Heartfilia family. They are not afraid that the Heartfilia family will not pay them. Putting aside the fact that a family as large as the Heartfilia family would not lose their integrity just because of this small reward. The Magisters Guild standing behind them was not someone to be trifled with either. Harry and Cora walked cautiously in front of Lin, and returned to the residence of the three of them anxiously. Under the anxious gazes of the two people, Lin En went straight back to his room. Seeing Lin returning to his room, Harry and Cora breathed a sigh of relief. Who is this person? Why haven't I heard of such a master before? Harry swallowed. When they returned to the villa when they saw Lin, who was bright red and covered in thick blood, he was also shocked by Lin's appearance. He thought Lin had suffered multiple injuries, but they never thought that Lin En's answer would make both of them fall into silence. "It's all the enemy's blood." The short 6 words left the two of them speechless. The pungent smell of blood seemed to still surround the tips of their noses. They shuddered and quickly shook their heads, not daring to speculate on Lin En's identity. The next day, Lin woke up naturally after sleeping. When he walked out of the room, he saw Cora and Harry sitting in the living room, and Heartfilia's butler was also sitting in the living room waiting. "Mr. Lin, you're awake." Seeing Lin En walk out of the room, the Heartfilia family's butler immediately stood up. With a professional smile on his face, he bowed slightly to Lin En and said with a smile, "Mr. Lin En, the master asked me to invite you. Go there." Lin En nodded slightly and walked straight to the bathroom. "Wait for me to wash up." After saying that, there was a sound of rushing water in the bathroom. The butler of the Heartfilia family did not rush. He stood with his hands by his side and lowered his head, waiting for Lin. Not long after, Lin walked out of the bathroom. He said to him, "Let's go." "Aren't you going?" Walking to the door of the villa, looking at Harry and Kuila who had packed their bags and were about to leave, Lin asked with his head tilted. The two of them were immediately frightened, and Kuila quickly said, "Our reward €s already arrived, we plan to say goodbye to you and leave." Lin En nodded slightly and followed the butler of the Heartfilia family towards the outside of the villa. With his back to the two of them, he waved his arms and said, "See you soon." Looking at Lin En's back, the two of them couldn't put the young man in front of them together with the murderous god who was stained red last night. They raised their heads and looked at the tall mountain peak in the distance of the manor. The mountain stream was blasted through. The huge hole was still there. Following the butler, Lin En's mind began to wander. What happened to the state last night? What on earth is that negative emotion filling my mind? At that time, there seemed to be nothing in Lin En's mind, only the consciousness of killing filled Lin En's mind. I just want to completely wipe out all life in front of me. I called out to the system in my mind, but the system seemed to be sleeping, with no movement at all. This made Lin feel helpless. I don't know when the negative emotions in my mind will appear again and whether they will affect me. Just as Lin was deep in thought, a voice interrupted Lin. Lin En pulled his mind away from his mind, raised his lowered eyes and looked in front of him. Jude appeared not far ahead with a little blonde Lolita. The butler of the Hartfilia family stopped behind him, bowed slightly to Lin En and said, "Mr. Lin, I'm waiting for you." Lin En nodded slightly, stepped forward and walked towards the front door. Jude walked over. "Mr. Lin, did you sleep well?" Jude asked with a smile on his face, looking at the dark-skinned boy in front of him with a smile. Glancing at the timid little blonde girl in a princess dress, Lin thought to herself, this must be Lucy. He calmly lowered his gaze on Jude, and then said, "Where is my reward?" Seeing Lin En being so straight to the point, Jude's mouth twitched slightly, then took a deep breath, waved behind him, and a maid came to Lin En with a plate. On the plate was a black card. This is the stored value card of the Hartfilia Chamber of Commerce, which contains your reward. You can withdraw money at any bank in the Kingdom of Fury. Lin nodded slightly, reached out and put the stored value card on the plate into his pocket. After doing all this, Lin tilted his head and glanced at Jude and asked, "Is there anything else?" Jude pointed behind Lin En and said to Lin En, "Mr. Lin En, was that what you did last night?" Lin En turned around and saw Jude pointing at the half-destroyed mountain peak behind him. Lin En nodded and said, "I did it. Do I have to compensate?" Jude waved his hand and said with a smile, "Mr. Lin is joking. That mountain is also the property of the Hartfilia family. If it is destroyed, just destroy it." Lin En frowned, glanced at Jude who was smiling and said, "Is there anything else?" "If nothing else, I'll leave. The purpose of Lin En's trip is actually to see Lucy when she was a child. Now that she has seen her, there is no point in staying here anymore." Seeing Lin En who was already a little impatient, Jude didn't hesitate. He said slowly, "Mr. Lin En, I heard that you are still just a mercenary in the mercenary union." Lin En frowned and stared at Jude in front of him. Seeing that Lin En didn't speak, Jude quickly said, "To be honest, I am also entrusted by someone. Someone wants to see Lin En." Mr. Lin En's eyes were filled with impatience, and he waved his hand and said, "If he wants to see me, let him come to me himself." After saying that, Lin En turned around and walked towards the outside of the manor. Seeing Lin En turn around and leave, Jude quickly called out to Lin En. "Mr. Lin En, someone from the royal family wants to see you." Lin En stopped and turned around slowly. When Jude saw Lin En stopping, he immediately breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that Lin En was frightened by the name of the royal family. The next moment, Lin En turned around. He turned around, with a cold look in his eyes, and said to Jude, "I don't care if he is from the royal family or some other chaotic force. If he wants to see me, let him come to me in person." After saying that, Lin En turned around, and suddenly a pair of wings appeared behind Lin En. In Jude's ugly face, Lin En flapped his wings and rushed straight up to the sky. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared into the Hartfilia family's manor. Looking at Lin's missing figure in the sky, Jude's face was extremely gloomy. After a while, he sighed heavily and couldn't help but reveal a wry smile. Jude, who was extremely disappointed, did not notice that Lucy's eyes beside him seemed to be shining with light, looking at the direction where Lin disappeared. Jude did not know that the daughter he had carefully cultivated was just like this, attracted. "Send the lady back. Dad, I want to go see Mom." Lucy raised her head, looked at Jude's back and shouted softly. Jude paused, then nodded and said, "Then don't disturb your mother's rest, okay?" A smile appeared on Zai's face, and she followed the maid towards another villa. Layla Hartfilia was there. Because Layla was ill, Jude arranged a villa for Layla to rest. The noisy Lucy was not allowed to disturb Layla. Jude turned back with a sullen face and said to the maid behind him. The maid nodded, walked to Lucy, took Lucy's white little hand and walked towards the villa. Walking in. Lucy stood at the door of the villa reluctantly, looking back at the sky from time to time. After leaving the Hartfilia family, Lin fluttered his wings and galloped straight towards the Warcraft forest. N wanted to find out what the negative emotions in his mind were that affected his emotions. Lin N used all his strength, and sonic booms continued to explode in the air, causing a lot of noise on the ground. However, they were unable to see what the afterimage in the sky was, and saw an extremely fast afterimage disappear above their heads in an instant. Back in the Warcraft forest, the air was filled with Lin's familiar scent. Lin fluttered his wings and returned to the place where he had stayed for a year. There were a lot of dead trees placed vertically in the huge open space, and gravel was everywhere. Originally, this place was supposed to be a dense forest, but because of Christine, all the surrounding trees were crushed down, and the boulders were crushed by Christine's huge body. That's why there was such a big open space. When Lin came here, he suddenly smelled a smell in the air. Lin N's vertical pupils suddenly became sharp, and he looked towards the pile of rubble not far away. As expected, above the rubble, an extremely huge, white python was crawling on the rubble. Because the body of the giant python was somewhat similar to the rubble, Lin N did not notice the figure of the giant python for a while. If it weren't for Lin smelling a smell in the air that didn't belong to him and Kristen, Lin might not have been able to spot the giant python. Discover Lin staring at him closely, the giant python with a good IQ also knew that Lin N had discovered him. He slowly raised his body and looked down at Lin N. The sharp snake teeth sparkled under the reflection of the sun. Seeing that the giant python dared to raise his body to challenge him, Lin N's vertical pupils swelled slightly, and a terrifying aura was suddenly released from Lin N's body. At this moment, the birds in the surrounding woods suddenly began to take off, flying towards the sky in panic. There were also many roars of monsters in the forest. The forked tongue spit out from the python's mouth, and the faint sound echoed in Lin's ears. This giant python was not originally from this area, because Lin N killed a lot of monsters around here, which caused a lot of monsters from other areas to come. They didn't know how terrifying Lin was. Only the aborigines in this area knew how terrifying the human being in front of them was. The giant python straightened up its huge body, reaching a height of tens of meters. Lowering his eyes, Lin grinned and said with a chuckle, "What a unique welcome ceremony. But what I hate most is looking up to others." As he spoke, Lin N flapped his wings behind him, and the aura belonging to the dragon clan was released immediately. He let out a loud roar and then rushed straight towards the giant python. Lin N's figure turned into a black afterimage in the air, appeared in front of the giant python's huge body in the blink of an eye. Without using any magic, Lin N stepped forward and planned to fight the giant python hand to hand. If a human magician saw this, he would definitely exclaim that Lin N was crazy. He actually fought with the monster. The monster's body was notoriously powerful. The giant python roared and twisted its body, trying to crush Lin N's body alive. With claws, scales, and wings. Lin N was now like a real dragon. Powerful power surged directly from Lin N's fist, and punched the python's body instantly. It is said that hitting a snake will hit you 7 inches. Lin didn't know where the 7 inches of the giant python in front of him were, so he hit it all over the body. The huge force almost knocked the giant python's body straight away, and the pain was excruciating. The giant python let out a shrill scream, but this did not stop Lin N. The murderous negative emotions emerged in his mind again, and Lin's eyes gradually turned red, and Lin became crazy and kept tearing at the giant python. The body, bright red blood spilled on the ground, dyeing the gravel and dead wood red. The screams of the giant python filled his ears, and Lin N seemed to be enjoying it, constantly torturing the giant python in front of him. He screamed, and used force with his arms to tear open the giant python's body. Bright red blood sprinkled on Lin N's body, and his red eyes showed a violent murderous intent, which did not subside at all after killing the giant python. Lin kept taking deep breaths, and the violent emotions in his mind receded a lot. Lin sat on the ground and gasped, not knowing what the negative emotions lurking in his mind were, but this thing could completely stop him. It will affect him. If he fails to control this negative emotion, he will be driven into a real madman one day. With a sullen face, darkness gathered in Lin En's hands and tore it apart. The giant python's body was gradually swallowed up and gradually disappeared in front of Lin En. Lin En returned to the Warcraft forest again, but Lin En did not go to fight the Warcraft in the forest as usual. Now Lin En did not need to pass through fighting with Warcraft to control his own abilities. Day after day, Lin En still had no clue about the negative emotions in his mind. However, Lin En found that as long as his emotions did not fluctuate too much, there would be no problem. When he has murderous intent, this emotion will not affect him. Suddenly, Lin suddenly remembered that he had swallowed the dragon soul of Black Dragon King Christine. Could this be the regret of Black Dragon King Christine? Or resentment? This negative emotion may be Black Dragon King Christine's regret, or resentment. Only this can affect yourself. After all, his own soul only swallowed Christine's dragon soul, and this kind of problem only appeared after that. Thinking of this, Lin En sat cross-legged on the ground, sinking his thoughts into his mind. In his mind, Lin didn't know what form the negative emotions existed in his mind. The violent aura in his heart moved slightly, and a black mist suddenly appeared in Lin En's mind, and then began to merge into his own spirit. He and his own soul began to blend with each other, and with the appearance of the black mist, the violent emotions in his heart were magnified hundreds of times, and he wanted to completely destroy everything in front of him. Lin immediately understood that the black mist that appeared in front of him was the negative emotion. Controlling his soul to touch the black mist, he used his soul to wrap it up. The next moment, all kinds of negative emotions filled Lin's soul. I saw Lin En holding his head in pain. The various negative emotions made Lin En extremely painful. He held his head and screamed on the ground. This is pain deep in the soul, not physical pain. The torture of her soul made Lin extremely painful, and she even wanted to die. Ah! The beast-like roar in his mouth caused the monsters in the surrounding forest to flee wildly. On Lin En's body, waves of darkness began to spread out, firmly covering the entire open space. Lin En's hands, his eyes turned red, and he was mumbling something unclear. Get out of here! Get out of here! Lin waved his hands to drive away things that did not exist in front of him. After a long time, the redness in Lin's eyes gradually receded, and Lin's eyes gradually regained some clarity. Lying on the ground, Lin gulped, breathing heavily. After only a slight contact with the black mist, Lin felt as if his soul was polluted. Seeing that the illusion was finally gone, Lin was relieved. It was painful, but Lin En was immersed in his mind again. It could be seen that the black mist had been dissipated a little. If you didn't look carefully, you wouldn't be able to see it, but Lin En's eyes flashed with joy, but he thought of the pain he had just suffered. The vertical pupils in Lin En's eyes could not help but shrink slightly. Overall, this wasting black mist was just a drop in the bucket. If he wanted to swallow up all the negative emotions in his mind, he would probably suffer for a long time. Although it was painful, Lin En could clearly feel that his soul had been strengthened a lot. It seemed that the dragon soul that had swallowed Christine had not completely merged with his original soul. The intensity is really integrated with Christine's dragon soul. After opening his eyes again, it is not known whether it is Lin or Christine. The system must have blocked most of Christine's dragon soul for him to slowly absorb in the future. And most of this dragon soul contains Christine's endless resentment. This is why Lin absorbs Christine's dragon soul and has no self. The conscious dragon soul mistakenly thought that Lin En was Christine, so negative emotions and dragon souls burst out one after another, which affected Lin En's self-emotions. Lying on the ground with big characters, Lin En let out a heavy breath. There was a smile on Leng Han's face. Now that the reason has been found, there is no need to be afraid of what is going on. If the dragon soul cannot be completely swallowed, the negative emotions existing in the dragon soul will disappear sooner or later. In order to influence himself into a madman who only knows about killing, Lin En decided to temporarily live in this monster forest until he could completely devour the dragon soul. In the next day, Lin En would only spend time eating, drinking and eating. All used to erase the negative emotions in his mind and swallow the dragon soul in his mind. Every day after Lin En erases the violent negative emotions, his soul will become stronger. Although Lin En has suffered a lot of torture and pain, the strength of Lin En's soul is also constantly increasing, which also makes Lin En very motivated. Although the dragon soul swallowed every day is just a drop of water in the ocean, as Lin En's soul continues to increase, Lin En can become stronger every day. The number of dragon souls he swallowed also increased, and as the dragon souls were swallowed one by Lin En's soul became stronger and stronger, and Lin En's own magic power began to increase. Now Lin En no longer knows that his strength has reached what level. A year has passed like this. Feeling that the negative emotions about the size of a human figure in his mind were completely dissipated, Lin En suddenly opened his eyes, with a touch of excitement in the vertical pupils in his eyes. For a year, Lin En continued to improve his soul, and finally, from a drop of it at the beginning, to now being able to completely eradicate negative emotions the size of a human. Only Lin En knows how much hardship he endured. Lin En wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and completely devoured the last dragon soul in his mind. A satisfied smile appeared on the corner of Lin En's mouth. It is finally over. It is finally over. Lin En revealed a smile at the corner of his mouth, lowered his head and looked at his slightly dark hands, and couldn't help but murmur to himself. Lin En has now completely devoured the dragon soul of Black Dragon King Christine, and the negative energy contained in the dragon soul has been completely wiped out by Lin En. In the future, he no longer has to worry about being negatively affected by Black Dragon King Christine. Emotions affect yourself. And now that Lin has completely absorbed Christine's dragon soul, the strength of his soul is countless times stronger than before. At the same time, his own magic power has also increased several times. Now Lin En doesn't even know what level his strength has reached. The strength of the soul is linked to magic power, and Lin's physical body is constantly getting stronger as time goes by. This is the racial strength of the dragon clan. Roar. Feeling his own profound magic power, Lin En couldn't help but let out an excited roar. The monsters in the forest were frightened by Lin En's voice and fled in all directions. The birds in the sky also flew around in panic. Slowly exhaling, Lin looked at the piles of rubble. This is the place where he has stayed the longest since he came to this world, but this time he will not leave again. The opportunity will come back here again. Lin stood up and glanced around slowly. Just as he was about to leave, there was a sudden tremor in the bushes in front of him, and his eyes suddenly stopped. Lin's vertical eyes suddenly became serious, and he looked sharply into the trembling bushes. Lin En's hearing was extremely powerful, and he heard a human voice coming from the bushes. Said, "Believe me, it must be right, there must be an exit behind this." Quote. Tisk, you've said this many times. As the sound got closer and closer, two figures walked out of the bushes. Two figures, one old and one young, appeared in Lin En's sight. The old man among them was short in stature, but he exuded a very powerful energy. The breath made Lin En solemn. When he saw the two of them walking out of the forest, the old man raised his head proudly and said to the young man beside him, "Did you see that? I just said that I must be right. This is the exit." But the young man did not answer the old man's words, and looked directly behind the old man. The old man turned around and murmured to himself, "What's behind this, why is it ignoring me?" After turning around, the old man saw Lin En standing among the rubble, wearing black clothes. The old man was slightly startled, with a look of disbelief flashing in his eyes, and then he stretched out his hand to protect the young man under his arms. Behind him, he looked at Lin En with solemn eyes. "We, the grandfather and grandson, did not know that this is your residence and entered here by mistake. Please forgive us and we will leave now." As he said that, the old man pulled the young man and got into the bushes behind him, ignoring the young man's struggle. Lin En did not hide the magic power and aura emanating from his body. The old man could tell at a glance that Lin En was extremely powerful. Even there was no guarantee that Lin En could be captured, but the young man continued to struggle in the old man's hands, staring directly at Lin En and shouting, "Old man, let me go. He smells like a dragon." The young man's words made the old man stop immediately, and looked at Lin En with a little surprise in his eyes. The old man looked at Lin En apologetically, and then said to the young man with a heavy face, "He is very dangerous. Let's get out of here quickly. I do not want. I'm looking for Igneal." The boy kept struggling in the old man's hands, trying hard to rush to Lin En and ask clearly. When these two people appeared, Lin En had already recognized the identities of these two people. The president of Fairy Tale, Makarov Dolaya. And the male protagonist of the original fairy tale, Natsu Dragneel. Makarov looked heavy, but still released his grip on Natsu and looked at him solemnly. Lin stood motionless in the distance. After breaking free from Makarov's hand, Natsu rushed towards Lin's direction with expectation in his eyes. He looked at Lin and asked, "Do you know Igneal? You smell like a dragon, you must know where Igneal is, right?" Natsu's eyes were extremely expectant, staring straight at Lin. In Natsu's expectant eyes, Lin slowly raised his lowered eyes, and after glancing at Natsu's face, the corners of his mouth outlining a faint arc, he said, "What Igneal doesn't recognize, the reason why I smell like a dragon is because I ate a dragon." After the words fell, both Natsu and Makarov were startled. Makarov looked at Lin blankly. Eat a dragon. Makarov believes that dragons exist in this world, but he didn't expect that in just a few days, he would meet two teenagers who were related to dragons. Not to mention that one of them was raised by a dragon, and the other even said that he ate a dragon. "You're lying." After Natsu reacted, he immediately stared at Lin En with anger and shouted. "Natsu! Don't be unreasonable." Seeing Natsu's appearance, Makarov was immediately frightened and quickly yelled at Natsu. "The dragon is so strong, how could it be eaten by you? You obviously look no older than me." Natsu stared, looking at Lin with disbelief in his eyes. "That's because you're a waste. You are not qualified to compare with me." Lin raised the corners of her lips, looked at Naz mercilessly and said contemptuously. "Because you are weak, you are not qualified to compare with me." Lin tilted his head, raised the corners of his lips and looked at the young man in front of him. There was a hint of contempt in the vertical pupils of his eyes, and he said to Natsu unabashedly. As soon as Lin's words fell, Makaro husband and Naz were both stunned on the spot. Naz reacted, anger flashed in his eyes, and he yelled at Lin, "Say it again. I said you are a waste. Is this the only skill that comes out of the dragon sect?" The joking in his eyes turned into ice coldness, and a terrifying aura emanated from Lin's body. Natsu's expression changed slightly. He had only felt this aura from Igneal. Human beings, how could there be a dragon's aura? Natsu gritted his teeth, stared at Lin angrily, and squeezed out a sentence through his teeth. "I will not allow anyone to insult Igneal. You apologize to me." Natsu's body ignited with flames, and his eyes glared at Lin. "Apologize. See if you have that strength." Lin curled his lips, and a touch of darkness spread out from Lin's body. It immediately spread to the ground and spread to the surroundings at any time along the ground. Makarov wanted to step forward and take Natsu away, but before he could act, he heard Lin En said coldly, "Your Excellency Makarov, if you do it casually, I can't guarantee this kid's life or death." Lin's words immediately made Makarov's hands and feet go cold. But he stopped moving forward. The iron fist of the fire dragon. The flames wrapped around Natsu's fists. Natsu withstood the terrifying pressure emanating from Lin's body, rushed forward, and thrust his fist straight into Lin's face. Boom! Before the fist wrapped in flames touched Lin, Natsu suddenly felt a sharp pain in his stomach. The next moment, he was kicked out by Lin and landed heavily on the rubble. Holding his stomach, Natsu spat out a mouthful of transparent liquid. The heartbreaking pain continued to come, making Natsu almost lose the strength to stand up again. The teasing look in Lin's eyes made Natsu grit his teeth. "Stand up. I must make you apologize." Natsu gritted his teeth, his eyes full of stubbornness and anger towards Lin. The flames on his body became more and more intense, gradually covering Natsu's body. Makarov stood in the distance anxiously, wanting to go to bed. He stepped forward to stop Lin En, but he was afraid that he would anger Lin En and make Lin En kill Natsu. With a flick of his lips, Natsu stood up from the ground, shaking as if he would fall down at any time. Z still stood on the ground and glared at Lin En in front of him. "Let you know. The skills Igneal taught me." After saying that, a magic circle condensed in Natsu's mouth, and the continuous fire magic molecules around him converged towards Natsu's mouth. The magic power all over his body was mobilized and condensed towards his mouth. Fire dragons. Roar. A raging flame instantly spurted out from Natsu's mouth and swept towards Lin En. The high-temperature flame instantly ignited the dead wood on the ground and melted the gravel. Look at the flame that appeared in front of you in the blink of an eye. Dragon breath. A look of surprise flashed in Lin En's eyes, and then there was a compliment. However, Makarov became a little worried when he saw this scene. Whether this move can hurt Lin En is another matter. If Lin En was injured by this move, how would they leave the Warcraft forest? The next moment, Lin En opened his mouth and a black magic came out of his mouth. The formation began to condense, and the raging flames were instantly sucked into the black magic formation. Within a few breaths, the pillar of fire that Natsu sprayed was swallowed up by Lin, and a shock flashed in Makaro's eyes. The husband looked at the scene in front of him in disbelief. Because of this roar, the magic power in Natsu's body had been drained, and he looked at Lin En in disbelief with a pale face. Impossible. How could you possibly eat my flames? Lin grinned, looked at Natsu and said with a smile, thanks for the hospitality. Seeing the smile on Lin En's slightly dark face, Natsu suddenly became angry. Although there was no magic power in his body, he still staggered forward to fight. Lin En curled his lips and came to Naz in an instant. In front of Z, a hand knife hit Natsu's neck. Natsu's eyes suddenly rolled and he fainted, falling limply to the ground. Lin stretched out his hand and took Natsu's arm, pointing him directly towards the horse. Karlov threw him in the direction. Makarov quickly became huge and caught Natsu. He looked at Lin suspiciously and pointed to the other side and said to the two of them. If you keep walking in this direction, you can leave the World of Warcraft forest in about 2 days. Makarov was slightly startled and looked at Lin's back. Seeing Lin turning around to leave, Makarov quickly shouted, Child, what's your name? Lin En paused and said without looking back, Lin. Child, where are you going? Seeing that Lin En was alone, Makarov suddenly had an idea in his mind and hurriedly shouted at Lin En's back. Lin En stopped and kept thinking about it in his mind. Where is he going now? Lin stopped, and Makarov knew that his opportunity had come and quickly said to Lin, if you don't know where to go to my guild. If you don't know where to go, come to my guild. Makarov looked directly at Lin with earnest eyes. Although Fairy Tail is now considered to be the middle and upper reaches of the Fury Kingdom, there are also many talented young magicians in the guild. But Makarov noticed Lin's talent and strength. Lin seemed to be about the same age as Natsu, and his strength had already reached this point. Makarov was naturally very jealous of Lin. By joining Fairy Tail's strength can reach another level. Lin stopped and looked at Makarov with interest. Lin met Makarov's earnest eyes. En raised the corners of his lips, looked at Makarov not far away and said with a smile, are you sure? Makarov was slightly startled. Looking at the malicious smile on Lin's face, he suddenly felt a little hesitant in his heart, but then he nodded and said, as the president of the Magisters Guild, for it is my duty to guide the lost children. Lin curled up the corner of his mouth. Seeing Makarov's righteous expression, Lin touched his chin with a look of thought in his eyes. After coming to the world of Fairy Tail, Lin has been thinking about what to do. Live. Now that he has the strength to protect himself, he may be able to meet the original characters in this world. Seeing Lin's silence, Makarov's eyes flashed with surprise, and then he looked forward to it. He looked straight at Lin En. After thinking for a long time, Lin En calmed down and nodded slightly to Makarov. Let's go and have a look with you. Makarov breathed a sigh of relief, and a joyful look flashed in his eyes. Okay, let's have a night's rest and set off tomorrow. Makarov held Natsu's body and looked at Lin with a smile. At this moment, Lin seemed to find it pleasing to the eye. Lin found a place to sit down by himself, closing his eyes and feeling. Lin En could feel that there seemed to be a little more unusual magic power in his body after swallowing Natsu's fire dragon breath. Lin En stretched out his palm tentatively, and with a thought, a flame suddenly rose in Lin En's palm. Although the flame was extremely weak, Lin En could feel the scorching heat on it. A look of surprise flashed in Lin En's eyes. He tried to inject magic into the flames, and the originally weak flames suddenly burst into flames, and the sky was instantly dyed with blazing flames. A blaze of red. Not far away, Makarov suddenly felt the surging magic power in Lin En's body, and immediately looked at Lin En, and then saw the surging red flame in Lin En's hand with a look of shock. The color flashed. He had seen this flame before. Isn't this the dragon fire on Natsu? But how could Lin use this kind of flame? He knew that Natsu was a dragon slayer. The magic used was also the lost magic, the dragon slaying magic. The scorching heat caused the surrounding dead wood to begin to burn, and the entire open space was enveloped in flames within a moment, turning into a sea of fire. Although the surrounding red flames were extremely hot, but Lin En couldn't feel the slightest burning sensation. He suddenly closed his palms, and the crimson flames that shot up into the sky were crushed by Lin En on the spot, turning into scarlet flames and dissipating in the air. Call. A breath of turbid breath came out of Lin En's mouth. Lin En could feel that the raging fire magic power in his body had increased a lot. He could now use fire dragon slaying magic. The high temperature around him made Natsu spin around in the coma. When he woke up, seeing the raging flames spreading around him, a look of confusion flashed in Natsu's eyes. Then he saw Lin standing in the flames, and Natsu quickly looked at Makarov beside him. Old man, what happened? Makarov stared blankly at Lin in the flames, his eyes full of disbelief. How is this possible? Before Natsu could figure out what was happening, he only heard Makarov's mumbling. Frowning, Natsu yelled noisily at Lin who was in the flames, "You black boy. Come out quickly. I want you to apologize to Ignial." As he spoke, Natsu ignored the flames around him. He stepped directly towards Lin who was in the flames. Natsu completely ignored the flames around him and walked towards Lin who was standing in the flames. The next moment, as soon as his arm touched the burning red flames, Natsu's pupils suddenly shrank and he stepped back. Looking at his burned forearm, Natsu had a look of disbelief in his eyes. How could he be injured by the flames? You must know that the fire dragon slaying magic that Ignial taught him can swallow flames and use flames to replenish his physical strength. The dragon's claws can tear into flames, the dragon's scales can defend against all fires, and the dragon's intestines can digest fire. But now he was burned by the flames, which made Natsu look shocked. What kind of flame are you? How could it possibly burn me? There was a slight tremor in Natsu's voice, and he felt that his belief had been impacted. This was completely different from what Ignial had taught him. Ignial had clearly said that the dragon's scales could withstand all attacks. Flame. Natsu lowered his head and looked at the burn wound on his arm. There was a strong burnt smell in his eyes, but Natsu felt a hint of disbelief in the flames. There was a very familiar smell, which was why Natsu didn't believe it. The smell was the same as the flames that Ignial breathed out. Hearing Natsu's voice, Lin relaxed. He slowly raised his head with a slight smile on his face, and without answering Natsu's question, he smiled at Natsu and asked, "Don't you think this flame is familiar to you?" Lin's words were like a heavy hammer hitting Natsu's heart. Before thinking of Lin's previous words, Lin, he ate a dragon. Natsu's eyes suddenly turned scarlet. With fire all over his body, he roared at Lin, "What did you do to Ignial? Give me back Ignial." As he said this, Natsu was filled with flames and charged straight towards Lin. The iron fist of the fire dragon. The fists were filled with flames, and they hit Lin En's face straight. The next moment, before Natsu could get close to Lin En, he felt his eyes spinning, and in an instant he saw that he was getting farther and farther away from Lin En. "If you continue to take action, I will think that you are challenging me to life and death, and I will not be so merciful next time." Lin En stood there, with a hint of chill in the vertical pupils in his eyes. Red flames ignited on Lin En's body and spread on Lin En's arms. As the red flames spread, another red flame appeared on his body. The darkness spread out, covering the red flames. Natsu wiped the scarlet corners of his mouth, with hatred in his eyes. At this moment, Natsu had already determined that Lin was the cause of Ignial's disappearance. The culprit. As long as he can kill Lin completely, he can bring Ignial back. Natsu's eyes were scarlet, and the blazing flames came out of Natsu's body. The darkness began to gradually spread towards the ground. "Stop. Just when Natsu was about to take action, Makarov behind him suddenly let out a dull roar, and then ducked in front of Natsu. Looking at the strong and burly Makarov in front of him, Natsu's eyes with a look of hatred in his face, he stared at Lin En in the distance and growled, "Old man, please leave it alone. I must avenge Igneel." Makarov covered his head, with a look of helplessness flashing in his eyes. He stretched out his hand and grabbed Natsu in his hand. Ignoring the burning heat in his palm, Makarov said to Natsu in a calm voice, "Natsu, things are not what you think. The disappearance of Lin and Igneel has nothing to do with it. How can it be? The fire on him smells like Igneel and me. That must be the dragon's flame." Natsu struggled in Makarov's hand, growling continuously in his throat. Seeing Makarov take action, Lin curled his lips, and then the darkness wrapped around him dissipated. Although Natsu is the protagonist of the original fairy tale, and Lin doesn't want to be his enemy. However, if Natsu insists on taking action, Lin will not show mercy to Natsu. With his powerful power, Lin's state of mind is no longer the same as before. He was very wrong. Makarov squeezed his palm hard, and Natsu groaned, but he still stared at Lin persistently. "I believe it would be the case." Makarov let go of his hand, and Natsu would rush towards Lin immediately. Makarov said in a deep voice, "Natsu, listen to me." Makarov's deep voice made Natsu wake up a little, but he still stared at Lin with hatred. Then Makarov told what he had seen before. Naz heard that Makarov at the words of her husband, a flash of disbelief flashed in her eyes. Just by swallowing his own flames, he actually learned his own magic. This was something that Igneel had taught him personally and had to work hard for many years. But this was how Lin En did it. He mastered his magic easily. Natsu didn't believe it, but the words came out of Makarov's mouth, so Natsu had to believe it. After a long silence, Natsu said in a low voice, "I understand, old man, please let me go. After I let you go, you are not allowed to be impulsive again. Lin is already a partner in our guild. The iron rule of fairy tale is that you are not allowed to attack your partners." Makarov slowly released his palm and placed Natsu in his palm on the ground. Natsu paused in his steps. Although the flames on his body dissipated, he still looked at Lin with a slightly not kind. After hearing Makarov's words, Lin was still a little shocked to join fairy tale. "Hello. Old man, I didn't agree to join your guild." "Hey, old man. I didn't agree to join your guild." Before Natsu could speak, Lin in the distance heard Makarov's words and immediately retorted. Makarov's face froze, then he laughed and said, it doesn't matter, you didn't promise me anyway, I'm going to my guild. I believe that as long as you go to my guild, you will definitely be attracted by my guild environment." Makarov's eyes were full of pride and pride. Lin remained silent. Under Makarov's advice, Natsu slowly believed Makarov's words. He looked at Lin as well. No more hatred. With Lin leading the way, the three of them quickly walked out of the Warcraft forest. Natsu was lying in the carriage with a pale look on his face. The husband looked at Natsu, who was lying in the car without love, and then looked at Lin, who was taking a nap with his eyes closed. The corners of his mouth couldn't help but twitch slightly. They were both dragon slayers. Why? The gap is so big. Makarov couldn't help but think of the other dragon slayer in the guild, Laxus. Although Laxus was the dragon slayer who was implanted with the dragon slayer crystal. But I didn't seem to have seen Laxus take any transportation. Could it be that the dragon slayer's weakness was transportation? After shaking his head, Makarov also closed his eyes and rested on the carriage. He stood up. He didn't pay attention to Natsu who was lying on the ground. As the carriage shook, Natsu's screams continued until they turned into faint moans for 2 or 3 days. After the torture, the three finally arrived at Magnolia, the town where Fairy Tale is located. The three stepped off the train, and the look of despair on Natsu's face suddenly disappeared. After taking a breath, Natsu asked Makarov tremblingly, "Old man, are we here?" Makarov nodded, pointed to the straight road ahead and said, "Go straight ahead from here, and it's my guild." Fairy Tale. Natsu's eyes lit up. It wasn't because he arrived at Fairy Tale. He finally didn't have to take transportation anymore. Natsu cheered, but the next moment his legs weakened and fell to the ground because of the motion sickness he had suffered for several days. Makarov had a look on his face. He looked at Natsu beside him complicatedly, and then turned his gaze to Lin on the other side. He saw Lin scanning the surrounding streets with curiosity in his eyes. Love raised his head and asked proudly, "How do you feel?" Lin glanced at Makarov with a strange face, and then walked towards the outside of Magnolia Station. The next moment, Lin's muttering reached Makarov's ears, making Makarov's face full of black lines. "I don't understand why this smelly old man is so proud. Does this city belong to him?" Looking at Lin's back in black casual clothes, Makarov let out a heavy breath. Now Fairy Tale is really going to be a shelter for strange little ghosts. Thinking of the few brats in the guild, Makarov couldn't help but cover his head with helplessness on his face. Plus Natsu and Lin now. The next generation of Fairy Tale is undoubtedly very powerful. But these little devils also have all kinds of strange personalities. Although Lin has not admitted to joining Fairy Tale, Makarov has regarded Lin as a member of Fairy Tale. Shaking his head, Makarov drove these strange thoughts out of his mind, stretched out his hand and pulled Natsu's collar, dragging Natsu towards the outside of the station. On the street, the residents of Magnolia saw Makarov and greeted the short old man with kindness and respect. Lin and Natsu followed Makarov. Natsu looked completely dissatisfied with Lin and turned his head aside. Lin didn't know what Natsu was feeling right now. Seeing that Natsu ignored her, Lin was happy as well, and the old god followed Makarov comfortably. Walking along the luxurious streets of Magnolia, I soon saw a tall building. Standing outside this building, Makarov turned around and said proudly, "This is my guild." Fairy Tale. Makarov closed his eyes, folded his arms, and waited. The two little devils in front of him exclaimed. The next moment, before Natsu and Lin could speak, suddenly a wine bottle flew out of the guild and landed directly on Makarov's head. Boom! The wine bottle hit the bullseye and made a dull sound. Whew! It sounds like a good start. Lin immediately raised the corners of his lips, folded his arms and looked at the scene in front of him. A look of surprise flashed across Natsu's face, and then he let out an exclamation. Makarov stood up with a dark face. A small bump has appeared on his head, but it looks extremely abrupt on Makarov's bald head. Brats! What are you doing? Makarov kicked open the guild door. The noisy sound made Makarov's mouth twitch and let out a deafening roar. As Makarov's voice fell, the noise in the guild suddenly stopped. Makarov had a dark face and glanced around the guild, then fell on the two people in the guild. Kana. Gray. As his anger increased, Makarov's body began to gradually become huge. The sunlight outside the door shone on Makarov's body, stretching his already tall shadow to an extremely long and narrow shape. You two brats! Makarov roared and grabbed Kana and Gray directly in his hands. His red eyes stared directly at Gray and Kana in his hands. Old man, don't get excited. President, let me go. Kana's red face and the smell of alcohol emanating from her body showed that she had drunk too much. Gray had already taken off his clothes without knowing when, leaving only a pair of underwear. Standing in Makaro Natsu, who was behind his husband, felt that the naked man was not pleasing to his eyes from the first moment he saw Gray, and the next moment he started to laugh at him. Is this perverted man also a magician? Old man. Natsu's words immediately caught Gray's eyes. The moment their eyes met, intense fire suddenly emitted. Hang your eyes, kid. Who do you think is a pervert? Gray's face was dark, and he roared at Natsu behind Makarov. Who else, isn't it you? Perverted naked man. Natsu pressed his nose, pointed at Gray with a split-mouthed laugh, and mocked. Gray was startled and quickly lowered his head to look at himself. He saw that the clothes on his body had disappeared at some point, and he couldn't help but feel. He exclaimed. When did you just discover it? All the magicians in the guild were shocked when they saw Gray, and they all shouted. Perhaps because he took off his clothes so quickly, Gray put on his clothes in less than a while. Makarov looked calmly and stared. He looked at the people in the guild and looked away as if they were doing something wrong, not meeting Makarov's eyes. Snort. I just want to be away for a while. Do you really have to do something? Makarov snorted coldly, but he didn't pursue this issue too much. After all, what kind of characters are these guys in his guild? How could he not know it himself? President, who are these two brats? Why did you bring back 2 brats as soon as you left home? That's right, President, is our guild a nursery? We go to the guild all day long to bring back some little devils. At this time, everyone in the guild also saw Lin En and Natsu at the door, and asked them curiously. Although most people's voices were filled with kindness, their words were mocking Ma. Karlov. Makarov snorted, looked at the people in front of him and said, "What do you know? Lin and Natsu are very powerful." Everyone was slightly startled. You must know that Makarov is one of the top 10 magicians in the Holy Saints. He can be called very strong by Makarov. Then you can imagine the strength of Natsu and Lin. And Natsu's magic is legendary magic. Lost magic. Dragon slaying magic. As Makarov's voice fell, everyone was suddenly surprised. They kept looking at Natsu. Dragon slaying magic. Natsu raised his head proudly, standing in front of everyone with extremely proud eyes, holding his arms. His arms were invincible to everyone. At this moment, a disdainful voice reached everyone's ears. Cut. He's just a kid with hanging eyes. What are you talking about, perverted naked man? Natsu suddenly became furious, glaring at Gray with his arms folded in the corner, disdainful. I'm talking about you, you little brat. Anger suddenly burst out from the two of them, and their heads hit each other hard, making a dull crashing sound. Just as the two were about to take action, Makarov punched the two of them hard on the head with a black face. Roared, "Stop it!" Lin stood aside, folding his arms and watching the scene in front of him with interest. The picture in his mind gradually overlapped with the scene in front of him. The corners of Lin's mouth were slightly raised, and he listened to the dull sound coming from the two heads. I couldn't help but smile in my heart. 2 good heads again. And him, Lin. Then Makarov set his eyes on Lin and said proudly, Lin is a genius that I only recruited after going through all kinds of difficulties. Everyone looked at Lin En curiously, wondering what magic this ordinary-looking boy with dark skin had. Everyone focused their attention on Lin En, waiting for Makarov's explanation. But after waiting for a long time, not hearing Makarov's voice again, everyone turned their heads and looked at Makarov. Makarov scratched his head and said with an embarrassed smile, I don't know Lin's ability either. What is it? Then what are you proud of? When Makarov's voice fell, everyone roared, causing Makarov to turn his back for a moment. Ahem, Lin, please introduce yourself to everyone. Makarov coughed lightly, and then turned his expectant eyes to Lin. Seeing everyone's eyes falling on him again, Lin folded his arms and leaned against the door, and said calmly, Lin, the Dragon Slayer of Darkness. As Lin's words fell, everyone in the guild widened their eyes and all focused on Lin, including Natsu and Makarov. Are you also a Dragon Slayer? Thanks for watching.